This happened during the summer of 2007 when I was 19 years old. At the time, I lived in a small town outside Roswell, New Mexico. There wasn't much there besides a few businesses, some ranches, and miles upon miles of empty desert roads. I was attending a local trade school while working part-time at an auto parts store. One of my closest friends, Tyler, had moved to Albuquerque after graduation. He shared a tiny apartment with 2 roommates near the university district. Since it was only a couple of hours away, I'd make the drive whenever I had a free weekend. One Friday afternoon, Tyler invited me to spend the weekend in the city. I jumped at the opportunity. The vehicle I drove back then was a battered old Ford Ranger that had seen far better days. The speedometer worked when it felt like it, one window wouldn't roll down, and the fuel gauge had been broken for nearly a year. Instead of fixing it, I kept track of fuel by resetting the trip odometer every time I filled up. Not exactly a reliable system. The drive to Albuquerque was uneventful. We spent the evening hanging out, ordering pizza, and eventually meeting up with some of Tyler's friends downtown. The next day was more of the same. By Saturday night, however, Tyler and his roommates had invited several people over. As the night went on, tension started building between one of the couples there. What started as an argument turned into an all-out screaming match. I wanted no part of it. Around midnight, I decided I'd rather just drive home than spend the night listening to people fight. I said my goodbyes and headed back toward the highway. For the first hour, everything was fine. The roads were nearly empty, and the desert stretched endlessly on both sides of me under the moonlight. Then my engine coughed. At first I ignored it. A few minutes later it happened again. My stomach dropped. I glanced down at the odometer and immediately realized my mistake. I had completely forgotten how many miles I'd driven since my last fill-up. The truck jerked once more. Then the engine died. I coasted onto the shoulder and sat there staring at the steering wheel in disbelief. I turned the key a few times. Nothing. I was out of gas. My cell phone was ancient and barely worked outside populated areas. Unsurprisingly, there wasn't a single bar of service. No calls. No texts. Nothing. I switched on my hazard lights and waited. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Eventually headlights appeared in the distance. I stepped out and waved both arms. The vehicle sped right past. The next one did too. After nearly an hour of getting nowhere, I finally gave up and decided to spend the night in the truck until daylight. At least then I could walk somewhere for help. I shut off the hazards to save the battery and reclined my seat. The desert was eerily quiet. Every now and then another vehicle would pass, but otherwise there was nothing. Eventually I began drifting toward sleep. Then I heard a door slam. I sat upright instantly. Looking through the rear window, I saw another vehicle parked behind me. Its lights were off. That immediately felt wrong. For a few moments I just watched. No one got out. No movement. No sounds. Curiosity eventually got the better of me. I stepped out and cautiously approached. The vehicle was an older SUV. The windows were dark. I couldn't see anybody inside. I called out. No response. I walked halfway around it. Still nothing. Feeling uneasy, I headed back to my truck. The second I shut my door, someone knocked on the driver's side window. I nearly jumped out of my skin. A tall man stood there smiling. The smile didn't reach his eyes. "Having car trouble?" he asked. I cracked the window slightly. "Ran out of gas." He nodded slowly. "That's unfortunate." Something about the way he said it sent chills through me. Then he pointed toward the road behind him. "Come help me with something real quick." I frowned. "Help you with what?" He didn't answer. Instead, his smile widened. Just step out. Every alarm bell in my head started ringing. I shook my head. The man's expression immediately changed. The friendliness vanished. His voice became cold. I said, "Get out." I didn't hesitate. I threw open the passenger door and sprinted toward the desert. Behind me I heard him yell something. Then footsteps. He was chasing me. The terrain was uneven and covered with brush, but adrenaline kept me moving. I ran deeper into the darkness until I reached a cluster of large boulders. There, I dropped to the ground and hid between them. The footsteps continued. Closer. Closer. Then they stopped. For several minutes I heard him walking around nearby. At one point he shouted into the darkness. "You can't hide forever." My entire body froze. I didn't make a sound. Eventually everything went quiet. Still, I stayed hidden. I wasn't taking any chances. The rest of the night felt endless. I remained tucked between those rocks until sunrise. Only when daylight arrived did I finally gather the courage to leave. The stranger's SUV was gone. When I returned to my truck, both doors were hanging open. The glove compartment had been emptied onto the seats. Anything remotely valuable was missing. Even a cheap pocketknife I'd kept in the center console was gone. A couple hours later, a rancher driving by stopped to help me. He gave me a ride to a nearby gas station where I bought a fuel can and enough gas to get moving again. After filling the truck, I headed straight home. I've never forgotten that night. Running out of gas left me stranded and vulnerable in the middle of nowhere. What scares me most is wondering what would have happened if I'd listened and stepped out of that truck when the stranger first told me to. This happened during my first year of college when I was 18. Back then, I thought I knew everything. I drove too fast, ignored good advice, and constantly pushed my luck. Looking back, I'm honestly surprised nothing worse happened to me before this incident. I attended a university nearly 4 hours away from my hometown. Whenever there was a holiday break, most students would leave during the day, but I always waited until late at night. Traffic was lighter, and I hated sitting in bumper-to-bumper congestion for hours. At the time, I drove an aging silver Honda Civic that had well over 200,000 miles on it. The car wasn't exactly reliable, but it got me where I needed to go. One thing I was notorious for was letting my gas tank get dangerously low. Friends would get into my car and immediately comment on the fuel light. I'd laugh it off every time. I always figured there was more fuel left than the gauge claimed. One December evening, after finals had ended, I packed my things and started the drive home around 10 p.m. The interstate was nearly empty. Everything was going smoothly until I noticed the fuel light glowing steadily on the dashboard. I wasn't worried. There would be another gas station soon. Or at least that's what I told myself. 30 minutes later, there still wasn't one. The needle had dropped so low it looked glued to empty. Then the car started jerking. My confidence disappeared immediately. The engine sputtered. A second later it did it again. I cursed under my breath and started searching desperately for an exit. Just ahead I spotted one. I coasted down the ramp, praying I could find a gas station before the tank completely ran dry. Unfortunately, the exit led to a narrow rural road surrounded by dense forest. No businesses. No lights. Nothing. The engine finally gave up. The car rolled to a stop on the shoulder. I sat there staring through the windshield in disbelief. The nearest town could have been 20 miles away for all I knew. Things got even worse when I checked my phone. No service. Not even one bar. I tried calling roadside assistance anyway. Nothing. The call wouldn't connect. Panic slowly started creeping in. I switched on my hazards and waited. Minutes turned into nearly an hour. The road remained empty. Finally, headlights appeared behind me. I jumped out and waved. The vehicle slowed. Then it pulled onto the shoulder behind my car. Relief washed over me. An older man climbed out. He appeared to be in his late 50s, maybe early 60s. He wore glasses and a heavy jacket. "Need some help?" he asked. I explained my situation. He nodded sympathetically. "Nearest station is a few miles away. I can take you there." Under normal circumstances, I would have said no. But I had no phone service, no gas, and no idea where I was. I didn't feel like I had many options. I locked my car and climbed into his sedan. At first everything seemed normal. He introduced himself as Larry and asked where I was headed. We talked casually for several minutes. Still, something felt off. I couldn't quite explain it. Maybe it was the smell inside the car. Maybe it was the way he kept glancing at me. I don't know. The road stretched endlessly through the woods. There were still no signs of any gas station. I asked how much farther it was. "Not much longer," he replied. A few minutes later I heard a thump. Then another. The sound seemed to come from somewhere behind us. I assumed something was rolling around in the trunk. The man kept talking as if nothing had happened. Then I heard it again. This time it sounded different. Not like an object shifting. More like someone hitting metal. My stomach tightened. I looked toward the back seat. Another loud bang echoed from behind us. The driver gripped the steering wheel tighter. He continued talking. Continued pretending nothing was wrong. That's when I heard it. A muffled scream. I froze. There was no mistaking it. Someone was in the trunk. The scream was followed by frantic pounding. The driver immediately turned up the radio. I looked at him. He looked straight ahead. Neither of us said a word. A few minutes later we reached a small intersection on the edge of a town. There was a traffic light. Red. The car stopped. The second we came to a halt, the pounding started again. Louder this time. Desperate. The driver finally glanced at me. The expression on his face had completely changed. The friendly smile he'd worn earlier was gone. I don't know what he was thinking. Maybe he knew I'd figured it out. Maybe he was deciding what to do next. I wasn't about to find out. I unbuckled my seatbelt, grabbed the door handle, and ran. The moment my feet hit the pavement, I sprinted. Behind me I heard him shouting. Then his car door opened. I expected him to chase me. Instead, he rushed back into his vehicle. The light turned green. A second later he sped away. I ran straight into the nearest open business, which happened to be a 24-hour diner. The employees looked shocked as I burst through the doors. I was crying and trying to explain what had happened at the same time. Someone immediately called the police. Officers arrived within minutes. I gave them every detail I could remember. The man's appearance. His vehicle. Where he'd picked me up. The direction he'd driven. Everything. Several officers searched the area while others stayed to take my statement. One officer later drove me back to my car. Another helped arrange roadside assistance. I finally made it home that morning, but I barely remember the drive. My hands shook the entire way. To this day, I still wonder who was trapped in that trunk. I wonder if the police ever found the man. And I wonder what would have happened if there hadn't been a red light giving me the chance to escape.
I live in a rural part of eastern Kentucky with my husband. It's a quiet area where everyone knows everyone, and most roads are surrounded by woods and farmland. I've always liked the peacefulness of living out there, But one night completely changed how I feel about driving alone after dark. At the time, I was working long shifts at a rehabilitation center about 40 minutes from home. Depending on staffing, I'd sometimes leave work well after midnight. This happened during one of those overnight shifts. I clocked out a little after 2:30 in the morning. I was exhausted, hungry, and ready to get home. Before heading back, I stopped at a small convenience store that stayed open all night. I grabbed a bottled drink and a snack, then paid for a few gallons of gas since I didn't need much to get through the week. While I was inside, I noticed a man standing near the coffee station. He wasn't buying anything. In fact, he wasn't doing much of anything except staring. Every time I glanced in his direction, he seemed to be looking at me. At first, I assumed I was imagining it. But when I walked to the register, I noticed him watching me through the reflection in the cooler doors. The cashier eventually called out to him and asked if he needed help finding something. The guy simply shook his head and walked out. I didn't think much of it after that. I paid for my things, pumped my gas, and got back on the road. About 20 minutes later, I was driving along a winding stretch of highway with almost no traffic around. That's when a warning light suddenly appeared on my dashboard. I frowned. The fuel light. That didn't make any sense. I had literally just bought gas. I glanced at the gauge and watched in disbelief as the needle slowly dropped toward empty. I thought maybe the gauge had malfunctioned. My car wasn't exactly new. Then I noticed something else. A strong smell of gasoline. Strong enough that I could smell it through the vents. A knot formed in my stomach. I pulled onto the shoulder and got out. The smell was overwhelming. Even with little knowledge about cars, I knew something was very wrong. I immediately called my husband. Thankfully, he answered. After I explained everything, he asked me a few questions before saying something that made my heart sink. Check underneath the car. I crouched down and shined my phone's flashlight beneath the vehicle. Fuel was dripping steadily onto the pavement. My husband went silent for a moment. Then he said, "It sounds like your fuel line's been damaged." I asked how that could happen. His answer wasn't comforting. Someone could have done it. At that exact moment, headlights appeared behind me. A vehicle was approaching. What made my stomach turn was the fact that its headlights suddenly switched off as it got closer. The vehicle rolled to a stop several car lengths behind me. My husband heard me gasp. "What is it?" he asked. I explained what I was seeing. His tone immediately changed. "Get away from the road." I didn't argue. I locked my car, grabbed my phone, and hurried toward the nearest house I could see. The property sat at the end of a long gravel driveway. Every light inside was off. I pounded on the front door. For nearly a minute, nothing happened. Then a porch light came on. An older man opened the door wearing a robe and looking half asleep. I quickly explained that my car had broken down and that someone might be following me. To my relief, he invited me inside. The house looked normal enough. Family photos, old furniture, nothing seemed unusual. He asked me to sit in the living room while he searched for a phone charger. I thanked him repeatedly. My phone battery was nearly dead. As he walked into the kitchen, I sat on the couch trying to calm down. That's when I noticed something. Across from me was a decorative mirror hanging on the wall. The mirror reflected part of the kitchen. I could clearly see the man moving around. At first, everything seemed normal. Then I watched him take a drinking glass from a cabinet. He filled it with water. After that, he looked over his shoulder. Then he reached into a drawer and dropped something into the glass. I froze. Maybe it was medicine. Maybe it was something harmless. But every instinct in my body told me not to drink it. The man stirred the water and carried it into the living room. He handed it to me with a smile. I thanked him, but didn't take a sip. Instead, I set it on the table beside me. He sat down across from me. For several uncomfortable minutes, he asked questions. Where did I work? Was I married? Did I live nearby? Something about the conversation felt wrong. Meanwhile, my phone battery continued dropping. Eventually, the man returned and told me he couldn't find a charger that fit my phone. That was enough for me. I stood up immediately. I thanked him for his help and said my husband was probably close. The smile disappeared from his face for just a split second. Then it returned. He walked me to the door. The second I stepped outside, I started jogging down the driveway. Once I reached the road, I cut through a line of trees and stayed hidden. I didn't trust anyone at that point. Not the vehicle that had stopped behind my car, and certainly not the man with the mysterious glass of water. My phone battery dropped to 1%. I quickly shared my location with my husband and sent a message explaining where I was. Then the phone died. For the next 20 minutes, I sat in the darkness listening to every sound around me. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. Every distant engine made my heart race. Finally, I saw a familiar pickup truck approaching. I stepped out from the trees waving my arms. It was my husband. The relief I felt is impossible to describe. I climbed inside and immediately broke down crying. Together, we drove back to my car. The vehicle that had been parked behind it was gone. But something else caught our attention. One of my windows had been smashed. The interior had been disturbed as though someone had searched through it. Fortunately, there was nothing valuable inside. A tow truck eventually arrived and took the car away. The next day, mechanics confirmed what my husband had suspected. The fuel line had been deliberately cut. To this day, I don't know whether the man at the gas station was responsible. I don't know whether the vehicle that followed me belonged to him, and I don't know what was in that glass of water. What I do know is that within the span of a single night, 2 different situations made me fear for my safety. Ever since then, I pay much closer attention to the people around me, especially when I'm alone.
This happened about 3 years ago while I was driving from Pennsylvania down to Georgia to visit an old friend from college. I've always enjoyed long drives by myself. There's something relaxing about being alone on the road with music playing and miles disappearing behind you. I left before sunrise thinking I could finish the trip in one day, but by the time midnight rolled around, I was completely exhausted. I had been driving for nearly 14 hours. Around 12:30 in the morning, somewhere in rural North Carolina, I decided enough was enough. I needed sleep before I ended up drifting into another lane. I took the next exit I saw. The exit only had a truck stop, a closed diner, and 2 small roadside motels. Neither looked particularly inviting, but I wasn't exactly shopping for luxury accommodations. I picked the cheaper one. The motel looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. The faded sign buzzed inconsistently, several exterior lights were burned out, and there were only a handful of vehicles scattered around the parking lot. The whole place gave off a strange feeling. I almost turned around and left. Unfortunately, I was too tired to care. Inside the office, a tired-looking clerk sat behind a scratched plexiglass window. He handed me a physical key attached to a giant plastic tag and barely said a word. He told me my room was upstairs. As I carried my bag across the parking lot, I noticed how quiet everything was. No traffic. No conversations. Nothing. Just the hum of a few fluorescent lights. The room itself wasn't terrible, just old. The carpet smelled damp. The air conditioner rattled loudly whenever it turned on. The bathroom light flickered occasionally. Still, it was a bed. That was all I needed. I locked the door, closed the curtains, took a quick shower, and climbed into bed. For about 15 minutes everything was peaceful. Then I started hearing voices through the wall beside me. At first I assumed it was a couple arguing. The deeper voice sounded angry. The higher voice sounded nervous. I rolled my eyes and turned the television volume up slightly. Unfortunately, the argument continued. Back and forth. Back and forth. The strange thing was how perfectly timed it sounded. Nobody interrupted each other. Nobody talked over one another. Each voice waited patiently for the other to finish. Eventually curiosity got the better of me. I muted the television and listened more carefully. That's when something clicked. The 2 voices sounded almost identical. One was simply pitched higher. I sat up immediately. Once I noticed it, I couldn't stop hearing it. There wasn't a couple next door. There was only one person. A single man carrying on a full conversation with himself. He would switch from a deep voice to a higher one and then answer himself as if 2 people were present. The realization sent a chill through me. It wasn't normal. It wasn't funny. It was disturbing. The conversation continued for several more minutes before suddenly stopping. Silence filled the room. I remember staring at the ceiling, hoping whoever was next door had finally gone to sleep. Then came 3 slow knocks against the wall beside my bed. Knock. 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 My entire body froze. A muffled voice came through the wall. "I know you're awake." The voice sounded playful. Almost amused. I didn't respond. A few seconds later came 3 more knocks. Then the exact same sentence. "I know you're awake." I grabbed the remote and turned the TV louder. For a moment everything went quiet. Then I heard a door open outside. My stomach dropped. I knew immediately it had to be the man from next door. The footsteps moved along the balcony. Closer. Closer. Until they stopped outside my room. The curtains were fully closed except for a tiny gap near one edge. I stared at that gap for several seconds. Part of me wanted to ignore it. The other part desperately wanted to know if someone was standing outside. Curiosity won. I slowly approached the window and pulled the curtain back just enough to see outside. The instant I looked through the gap, I nearly jumped out of my skin. A man was standing inches from the glass. He was trying to look inside. His face was so close to the window that we made eye contact immediately. I stumbled backward. The moment he realized I'd seen him, he began speaking. Except he wasn't speaking normally. He was changing voices. 1 second he sounded like a child. The next second he sounded much older. Then he switched to a strange accent. Then another. He kept cycling through different voices while pacing outside my room. At first it sounded ridiculous. Then it became terrifying. He eventually started knocking on my door. Each knock grew harder. Not enough to break it down. Just enough to let me know he wasn't leaving. I called the front desk immediately. The clerk sounded annoyed at first. Then he heard the knocking through the phone. His attitude changed instantly. He said he'd come up right away. The knocking continued for another minute. Then suddenly stopped. I looked through the peephole and watched the man quickly disappear into the room beside mine. Moments later the clerk arrived carrying a flashlight. He walked over and knocked on the neighboring door several times. No answer. He tried again. Still nothing. Eventually he came over to my room and asked what happened. After I explained everything, he sighed heavily. Apparently the man had been staying there for weeks. That answer alone convinced me I didn't want to remain anywhere near him. I asked if there was another room available. Thankfully there was. The clerk moved me downstairs near the office. I grabbed my belongings and relocated immediately. Once inside the new room, I finally started feeling safe. I locked every lock. Checked the windows. Then sat on the bed replaying everything that had happened. Eventually exhaustion won. I drifted off. Sometime later I woke up again. The room was still dark. What woke me was movement outside. I saw a shadow pass the window. Then again. And again. I carefully moved toward the curtain. Peeking through the smallest opening possible, I felt my stomach twist. It was the same man. He was slowly walking back and forth in front of my room. No voices this time. No knocking. No talking. Just pacing. Every time he passed, he turned his head toward my window. Watching. Observing. Waiting. I watched him repeat the same path several times before disappearing around the corner of the building. I never fell asleep again. The moment daylight arrived, I packed my things, loaded my car, and left. I didn't even bother checking out. I stopped for coffee at the first gas station I found and realized my hands were still shaking. To this day, I don't know what that man wanted. Maybe he was mentally unstable. Maybe he was just looking to scare someone. Either way, that night permanently cured me of staying at cheap roadside motels. This happened during my first year of college in 2023. I was attending school in Arkansas, and during spring break my family decided to take a road trip through parts of Missouri and Kansas. It wasn't anything extravagant. We just wanted to get away for a few days and see places we'd never visited before. The trip included my stepmother, my aunt, my younger cousins, my older sister, and me. It was basically a car full of women traveling together. After several days on the road, we began making our way back home. Unfortunately, we had miscalculated the drive. By late evening, we were still several hours from our destination and nobody wanted to continue driving through the night. Around 9 p.m., we pulled off the highway looking for a place to stay. The first motel we found looked old but decent enough for one night. Nothing about it immediately stood out. At least not at first. We checked in and carried our bags inside. Before settling down, we decided to grab dinner from a nearby burger place. While standing in the lobby, my aunt called asking which room she should come to because she wanted to change clothes before we left. My cousin answered loudly without thinking. She practically announced the room number to the entire building. That's when I noticed a man standing near the entrance. He wasn't checking in. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was simply standing there. Watching. I remember immediately feeling uneasy. Maybe it was because he seemed completely motionless. Maybe it was because every time I glanced toward him, he was looking in our direction. Whatever the reason, something felt wrong. I pointed him out to my sister. She laughed and told me I was overthinking things. I wanted to believe she was right. As we walked out, we passed within a few feet of him. For a brief moment, we made eye contact. The look he gave me wasn't angry. It wasn't friendly either. It was impossible to explain. It was the kind of stare that makes your instincts start screaming. We left anyway. Dinner took about 2 hours. When we returned, most of us were exhausted from driving all day. As soon as we entered the motel, I saw the man again. This time he was sitting alone in a dark corner of the lobby. The television nearby wasn't even turned on. He was simply sitting there. Doing nothing. Watching people come and go. That alone made me uncomfortable. Then my aunt called again. She'd forgotten the room number. Unfortunately, my cousin repeated it out loud a second time. I glanced toward the man. He was now talking quietly on a cell phone. His back was turned toward us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was listening. We headed upstairs. My sister and I shared one room while the others stayed a few doors away. For the first 20 minutes, everything seemed normal. We were scrolling through our phones and getting ready for bed. Then someone knocked. The sound nearly made me jump. I had spent the entire evening telling everyone about the man downstairs. My imagination immediately went wild. Thankfully, it was only my stepmother. The second we opened the door, she hurried inside and shut it behind her. That alone told me something was wrong. She looked genuinely rattled. Not scared. Terrified. She told us to start packing immediately. No explanation. Just pack. We began stuffing our belongings back into our bags while demanding answers. Finally she explained. A few minutes earlier she had opened her room door to throw away some trash. The moment the door opened, she found herself face to face with a man standing against the wall beside her room. Not walking past. Not checking his phone. Just standing there. Waiting. She said he stared at her without saying a word. Then he casually walked away and entered the room located between our rooms. The entire situation sounded wrong. Every instinct in my body told me we needed to leave. Fast. Within minutes everyone had gathered their belongings. My stepmother went downstairs to request a refund. Shockingly, the clerk approved it without much argument. That only made me wonder if strange incidents happened there regularly. While we waited outside near the vehicle, I noticed movement near the lobby entrance. The same man emerged from the building. At first I thought he was leaving. Instead, he stopped and began talking to another man standing near the parking lot. That second man appeared to be examining vehicles. He was peering through windows and tugging on door handles as if checking whether any cars were unlocked. My stomach sank. The two men glanced repeatedly toward us. I remember feeling frozen. Like I couldn't process what I was seeing. Then the second man nodded toward our SUV. A subtle gesture. Almost like a signal. The first man immediately turned and looked our way. I climbed into the vehicle as quickly as possible. By then everyone else was noticing the same thing. The atmosphere inside the SUV became pure panic. My stepmother was calling my father while trying to decide where we should go. Nobody wanted to stay. But nobody knew where else to go at nearly midnight. Then a third man appeared. He walked out from the side of the building and joined the other two. The three of them stood together talking while looking directly at our vehicle. That was enough for me. I started begging my stepmother to leave. Everyone else joined in. The men began moving slowly across the parking lot. Not running. Not rushing. Just walking. But they were definitely heading toward us. Finally my stepmother put the SUV into drive. We pulled away from the motel and onto the highway. I looked back through the rear window. All three men had stopped. They were standing together watching us leave. Nobody spoke for several minutes. The silence inside the vehicle felt heavy. Eventually we found another motel several hours later. It wasn't exactly luxurious. There were stains on the carpet and bugs in the bathroom. But compared to the place we just left, it felt like a 5-star resort. To this day, I don't know what those men intended to do. Maybe they were harmless. Maybe we misread the entire situation. But the way that first man lingered around the motel all evening, combined with the other men watching vehicles and approaching ours, still bothers me years later. All I know is that every person in our family felt the same overwhelming urge to leave. And sometimes it's better to trust that feeling than stick around to find out whether you're right.
A few years ago, my girlfriend Megan and I were driving from Ohio down to the Gulf Coast for a vacation. It was a brutal drive, nearly 16 hours, and I was determined to make it without stopping overnight. Megan disagreed from the beginning. She kept telling me I was going to fall asleep at the wheel if I kept pushing myself. About 10 hours into the trip, I realized she was right. It was well after midnight, and I was struggling to keep my eyes open. Every few minutes, I'd catch myself blinking longer than I should have. Megan had already searched for a place to stay and found a small roadside motel a few minutes off the interstate. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I was too exhausted to argue. The motel sat at the end of a narrow access road surrounded by trees. It looked like something built decades ago and barely updated since. There were only a handful of parking spaces and almost all of them were empty. I pulled into the lot and shut off the engine. Finally, Megan muttered as she stretched. The entire property was quiet. No traffic, no people outside, just a few buzzing lights hanging from the building. I walked into the office while Megan stayed in the car. An older woman was sitting behind the desk reading a magazine. She looked surprised to see a customer at that hour. I checked in, grabbed the room key and headed back outside. Our room was room 7, located at the far end of the building on the ground floor. Inside, it was exactly what you'd expect from a cheap motel. A bed, a small TV, a tiny bathroom, nothing special, At that point, it didn't matter. We just wanted sleep. After bringing our bags inside, we took turns brushing our teeth and getting ready for bed. While unpacking, I realized I'd left my charging cable in the truck. I groaned. The parking lot was only a short walk away, so I told Megan I'd be right back. She was already half asleep. I stepped outside and left the door slightly cracked behind me. The lot felt different now. When we'd arrived, the office lights had been on. Now they were off. The entire property seemed darker than before. The only illumination came from a few weak exterior lights attached to the building. I unlocked my truck and started searching through the center console. For some reason, I couldn't find the charger right away. I spent a minute digging around before finally spotting it wedged between some receipts. The moment I stood up, my stomach tightened. Someone was standing near our room. At first, I thought it was Megan. Then I realized the figure was far too large. The person was a man. He stood directly beside our door, not knocking, not walking, just standing there. The distance made it difficult to make out details, but I could tell he was watching the room. I immediately started walking back. As I got closer, he finally turned toward me. The man was tall and broad-shouldered. He wore a long, dark coat despite the weather being fairly warm. The strangest thing was his expression. He looked completely calm, almost cheerful. "Evening," he said softly. His voice barely rose above a whisper. I stopped a few feet away. "Can I help you?" I asked. The man smiled. "Oh no, just getting some fresh air." I glanced toward the empty parking lot. There wasn't much to look at. "You're staying here?" He nodded immediately. "Upstairs." Something about the answer felt rehearsed. I couldn't explain why. I simply nodded. "Well, have a good night." "You too," he replied. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The second I entered, I locked it. Megan was already under the blanket. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah." He does, sir. I didn't tell her what happened. At least not yet. Instead, I stood quietly near the door, listening. I expected to hear footsteps moving away. I heard nothing. No footsteps. No doors opening. Nothing at all. That bothered me more than if he'd walked away. Curiosity got the better of me. I crouched near the window and carefully pulled back a corner of the curtain. My pulse immediately jumped. The man was still there, exactly where I'd left him, standing motionless in front of our room, just staring. He wasn't looking at the parking lot. He wasn't looking at the sky. He was looking directly at our door. I watched for nearly 5 minutes. He never moved, not once. Eventually, I stepped away from the window and finally woke Megan up completely. She could tell from my face something was wrong. I explained everything. At first, she thought I was overreacting. Then I told her to look for herself. Reluctantly, she crawled over to the window. A few seconds later, she whispered, "He's gone." I felt relief wash over me, until she suddenly froze. Then she gasped. "What?" I asked. She pointed across the parking lot. I moved beside her and looked out. The man was there, standing near the opposite building, facing our room, facing our window. Even from that distance, it felt like he knew exactly where we were. The sight made my skin crawl. Neither of us said anything for a moment. The man simply stood there, watching. Eventually, I closed the curtain. Neither of us wanted to look anymore. For the next hour, we stayed awake listening. A few times, we thought we heard footsteps outside. Once we heard what sounded like someone walking slowly past the window, but we never worked up the courage to check. At some point, exhaustion finally won. We drifted off to sleep. When I woke up, sunlight was shining through the curtains. The first thing I did was look outside. The parking lot was empty. No sign of the man. No sign that he'd ever been there. We packed our things as quickly as possible and headed for the office. The same woman from the night before was working. I handed over the room key and casually mentioned the strange man we'd seen outside. Her expression immediately changed. "What man?" she asked. "The guy staying upstairs." She frowned. "There wasn't anyone upstairs." I laughed nervously. "No, there definitely was." She shook her head. "You two were the only guests here last night." The words hit me like a punch. I asked if maybe another guest had checked out early. Again, she shook her head. "No one else rented a room." I looked out toward the empty parking lot. "Do you have security cameras?" "No, sir," she replied. "Never needed them." Megan and I exchanged a glance. Neither of us knew what to say. We thanked the woman and left. As we drove away, I kept looking in the mirrors expecting to see that man somewhere on the property. But he was gone. To this day, I still don't know who he was, where he came from, or why he spent half the night watching our room. What I do know is that if we'd stayed there another night, I don't think either of us would have slept at all.